Hi everybody, it's a pleasure to welcome you here tonight at the Erasmus Paviljoen. My name is David Boeren and I work at Studium Generale, and we are a part of the university who organizes all kinds of lectures, events, pub quizzes, you name it. And tonight we put our hands together with the Porn Types project in organizing this almost yearly now an event, Let's Talk About Sex. Because we are going to talk about sex, porn and way more tonight. Before we go into it, some house rules. Today we are going to talk about, and maybe even see, explicit content. We want to have a productive and an adult discussion on this afterwards, so I want to stress that the questions should remain respectful and focus on the content of the lectures. And don't make any recordings, we'll record it tonight and then you can see it on YouTube tomorrow. And please leave your questions for the end. So, before we dive into it, maybe a quick warm-up. We're going to talk about porn, stereotypes. We know cliches like the MILF, the slutty schoolgirl, or a threesome. Just scream it at me, other cliches from porn. Ooh, very shy. MILF, yeah, another MILF. Anything else? Stepmom, stepbro, yeah, of course, sometimes they're stuck. What else? Oh, you're a little bit shy. We might talk about that later. Student with teacher. Actually, we might actually go into that later. So, we're going to talk about these and many more examples of stereotypes later. Yes, we'll get to it later. Tonight, we'll listen to different perspectives. First, we're going to dive into research of the Porn Types project that's being done here at Erasmus University. And afterwards, we're also going to look at sex and porn from a sexology perspective. How does it work? Can it be good or damaging for relationships or your sexual life? We'll talk about it later. Then, without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce our first speaker. She is someone who's been researching porn and sex her whole academic career, and currently she is leading the Porn Types project here at our very own Erasmus University. Please give a very warm welcome to Dr. Samira van Bohemen.
Is sexual fantasy, or what are sexual fantasies? And sexual fantasies are basically mental images that are sexually arousing, and that can be topics. So it can be about certain sexual acts, or it can be about certain sexual relationships, or certain sexual situations. And these sexual fantasies, they may happen spontaneously, for instance, when people drift off in their minds when they're having a conversation or before sleeping, or there can be something that people actively seek after, so something they actively seek.
People generally do not like to talk about it, oftentimes not even with their partners. And one of the results of that is that people tend to think about sexual fantasy as something that is very particular or individual to them. Yet, as many of you who may know me, this is a thing that I will always say, some of the things that we think are very personal and very individual are actually very much socially shaped, and that will be one of the main messages that I will convey today. Because our sexual fantasies are oftentimes formed after cultural scripts and social scenarios that play a larger role within society, and that also reflect many stereotypes that exist within society, like stereotypes about gender, or stereotypes about physical attractivity, or how sex should work. There are also many stereotypes about that, and these stereotypes tend to animate our sexual fantasies. Now, some of you may have also been here during this lecture last year, because we also had a Let's Talk About Sex lecture. And there I already created this slide in which I created the Tinder profiles for the two main protagonists of the 50 Shades of Grey. I don't know if it's a trilogy or if there are even more books about that. But it is a book that is very important in terms of that it has animated the sexual fantasies of many women around the world. And what this book reflects are, again, gender stereotypes. So we see the main male protagonist of the 50 Shades of Grey books. That is a very wealthy, very dominant man, whereas the woman tends to be more sexually submissive, more naive. So these represent gender stereotypes. And this is something that I researched with my research group. But we do not look at literature as something that conveys these stereotypes in sexual fantasies, but we look at another medium, which is both a reflection of sexual fantasies and also a very important stimulus of sexual fantasies, namely porn. And if we know one thing about porn, we know that it is full of all sorts of stereotypes. So one example of these stereotypes is the stereotype of the slutty schoolgirl, but also the playboy in itself, and the playgirls are also examples of sexual stereotypes that play an important role, for instance, in pornography. These stereotypes aren't only about gender. Some of them are also stereotypes about race and ethnicity. So, for instance, another category that some of you who have visited a porn website before may know. One popular character is the BBC, which I had to learn a couple of years ago has nothing to do with the British Broadcasting Agency, but very much something to do with the presumed size of some male genitalia. And what these stereotypes do is they reflect existing hierarchies within society, but also histories of social inequality. So the BBC, for instance, has a history within colonialism. And these things still animate our fantasies. But very interestingly, they do not appeal to everyone in the same way. And that is where my larger project is about. It is about how our attraction to stereotypes is socially shaped, and therefore is formed by the cultural ideas, for instance, cultural ideas that we learn about gender, cultural ideas that we learn about race and ethnicity, and also the norms and the values that are shaped on the basis of those ideas. And this means that if we internalize these norms and values and ideas, that's because people learn these in different contexts, they can learn it in different ways, which may also mean that some stereotypes may appeal to some of us, but not to others. And some people may also feel very, very conflicted about these stereotypes. And this is what drives my project. So in my project, we're trying to find out what these sexual stereotypes in pornography look like. What do they consist of? And how is the attraction that people feel towards these stereotypes formed? So why do these stereotypes appeal to some people, but not to other people? But the ultimate goal of this project is to create a healthier, more equal, and more fair sexual culture. So how do we do this? Well, luckily for me, I'm not doing this on my own, but I'm doing this with a research team with very smart people. And we have various, it's my project, so I think it's all very interesting. We have various interesting sub-projects in which we study how these stereotypes function. I can't get into all the details, but I will go over all of the highlights of our research so far. And in the first sub-project of the larger porn types project, we study sexual stereotypes in pornography by looking at the language of the titles of porn videos. So we ethically scraped a Pornhub, and we detracted 250,000 titles from Pornhub, and we look at the language that shapes stereotypes. And why do we look at language? Because language is very important in terms of culture. So we think about the world, and that means we also think about ourselves, and we think about other people in terms of language. So language is a very important source of culture. Now, of course, it's not possible to analyze 250,000 titles by hand. That would be very impossible. So what do we do in my project is we use basically learning models that are also used for all sorts of large language models. So if you use ChatGPT, there's a certain technology behind ChatGPT. It's called natural language processing, which is all about linguistics and a lot of mathematics. And these same techniques we use in this project to analyze pornography titles. And what do we look at in these pornography titles? Well, I have an example of a pornography title here. And we look at, for instance, the types of words that are used to describe certain social groups or categories. So, for instance, men and women. So we look, for instance, at the nouns that are used to describe men and women. And nouns in Dutch are zelfstandige naamwoorden. And we also look at the bijvoeglijk naamwoorden, or in English, the adjectives that are used to describe these social groups. So in this example, we have certain adjectives that indicate appearance, and the appearance-based adjective in this example is related to the female, to the female gender noun. But we also have certain age-based adjectives. And for one of the things that we look at, for instance, is, well, are men more often described as older in pornography titles, and are women, for instance, described more as younger in pornography titles? And we also look at grammar, because grammar is also important here. So we also look, for instance, at verbs, and whether these verbs indicate that certain social groups are more active in a porn scene or more passive. So who is the sexual object, who is the sexual subject? In this case, because the verb seduce relates to the female gender noun, we are talking about an active female here in this construction. So what we find? Well, we find, and that's not that surprising, we find overwhelming evidence of stereotyping within pornography titles. And one of the interesting things is, well, when you think about the grammar, one of the things that we're interested in, and one of the reasons we're interested in that is because we would assume that women are more objectified in pornography, so we would expect that they are described more as the sexual objects, and that men are described more as the sexual subjects in pornography. But here we were wrong, and I will give more examples of where our expectations didn't come out in this project. But this is one of the examples where our expectations were wrong, because basically women are described much more in pornography than men as the sexual subjects. And they're also more described as the sexual objects. Basically, titles about pornography are titles about women. So women are much more prevalent in titles about pornography, and they're also much more often described in terms of appearance-based adjectives. So they're described much more than men as being cute, or pretty, or beautiful, or hot. Those types of attributes are mostly directed towards women. Men are not very prevalent in pornography titles, and when they are prevalent, they are mostly reduced to penetrative agents, which are also described with strength and virility. So they are so very big, and so very hard, and so very large. Basically, and this is also where pornography basically is. So pornography, it tends to function within the extremes. So everything is bigger than within everyday life, or everything is smaller than within everyday life. And those types of adjectives that indicates bigness or smallness are also very much gendered and also very connected to ideas about race and ethnicity. Well, this led us to wonder, we have these examples of stereotyping in pornography, but how do consumers look at this? Or how do general people look at these stereotypes? And this is something we researched in 2 other projects, which we performed last year at Lowlands. So we went to the festival Lowlands with our research project Porn Fashions, and there we looked at both conscious and subconscious attraction to pornography stereotypes. And in our first sub-project, we looked at this conscious attraction to stereotypes. And therefore, we asked people to make confessions about their likes and dislikes towards stereotypes in pornography, towards gender stereotypes in pornography. So what we had people do is we gave them 32 titles of pornography videos, which we pre-selected. Some of these titles were highly gender stereotypical, so we had a dominant man and a submissive woman. And we had other titles that were more what we call vanilla. They weren't particularly gendered and everyone was having a good time. But we also sort of reversed engineered some titles in which we had a role reversal so that we had a dominant woman and a submissive man. And then we had an interviewer sitting behind a curtain, and they asked the person to rate these titles in terms of their attractiveness, and why, and they asked them then questions of why they find certain titles attractive or not. And what we found is that not everyone really enjoys gender stereotypes in pornography. There were many people, in fact, within this particular research, most people indicated that they disliked gender stereotypes in pornography. But of course, as with everything, some people really did enjoy these gender stereotypes, and there something interesting happens. Because for some people, they indicated that they enjoyed these stereotypes because, and that's something we would expect from cultural sociology, because this is something they've learned. So the stereotypical titles, they aligned with what they had learned about gender throughout their lives. So they aligned with their ideas about how sexuality should work for both men and women. But other people said, well, no, this really does not align with how I look at gender or how I would like to have a hierarchical relationship between men and women. I prefer much more that society would be equal in these terms. But in porn, I do enjoy watching these gender stereotypes, basically because they transgress my everyday values. So here it became the transgression of values that actually became exciting to people. So that's what was an important stimulus for them. And then something unexpected happened again, because some people basically did not care about gender at all in terms of what they liked or disliked about these titles, because they were all about the context. So if something was outdoors or in a hospital, they either very much liked it or disliked it. So we had an entire project about gender, and it's like, oh, it's not about gender at all, it's about the context. So we had one title with a hot nurse in it, and then they were, oh no, not the nurse, because I associate that with being sick, and that's not very appealing to me. In the next project, we looked at subconscious attraction, because one of the theories is that our attraction to stereotypes may be socially shaped, but may also move things within our bodies that we are not always aware of, so that we feel physical attraction to some things or physical rejection of some things without being fully cognitively aware about that. And we researched this by a similar setup as with the confessions. We had people, we showed them various titles of pornography, some of them highly stereotypical, some of them we had a reversal in terms of the hierarchy, and then we let them watch 8-second video clips that were associated with the titles. And we had 4 seconds that basically established the hierarchy within the video, and then 4 seconds that were very explicit. And what we expected, based on the theory, is that, well, people's heart rates would speed up. Because if people find something attractive or exciting, your heart will speed up. But of course, what happens when we looked at the data and we analyzed the data, we found out that people's heart rates slowed in our experiments, particularly when the sexuality became graphic. And what that indicates is not a form of attraction, but it indicates that people basically, their first reaction was a freezing reaction. So they had to sort of process, which happens very quickly, but they had to process what they were watching. So they sort of froze initially. And what we found is that this freezing reaction, the slowing of the heart rate, was actually larger for the pornography which had the role reversal, so which contradicted the expectations that people had about what normal hierarchies look like within pornography. So that's very interesting. Another thing that's very interesting that our data indicates right now is that this effect seems to be even bigger among women who are conservative, so who have conservative gender values. So this basically is a first indication of our theory that culture is not something that exists on the outside, that exists outside of our bodies, but that culture actually becomes something that becomes embodied, that becomes something that crawls under the skin of people and also shapes their likes and dislikes on a subconscious level, on a subconscious and a physical level. And this can have certain also problematic consequences, because it may also mean that people can also adopt pornographic stereotypes without being fully aware of them, so without critically assessing them. And this is something we're trying to address with our final projects. So we basically try to make people more aware. So we're trying to raise awareness of pornography stereotypes, and basically we're trying to take these stereotypes from the subconscious level towards the conscious level. And the way in which we do that is we have created a very fun and very confronting game, which is called Exposed, which you play sort of like a Guess Who game, but people guess who the other player's mystery porn character is, not based on physical attributes that you can see, but you guess on the basis of ideas you have about a sexual scenario. So for instance, you would ask the question, well, is your mystery porn star very likely to be attracted to a younger person, younger sexual partner? Or is your mystery porn star likely to play the role of the babysitter in this sexual scenario? And from these attributes, from these associations, people then, they try to find out which the other person is. And in this process, they also learn more about the stereotypes they sometimes also subconsciously hold. And they do this by making pornography stereotypes, in this case also fun and non-threatening to discuss. And that is important, because I think today, by the end of the night, you will walk away with the idea, which I think is a very valid and good idea, that sexual fantasies can be harmless. They can create a very safe space for people to experiment with social relationships, to experiment with hierarchies, to experiment with various identities, without people really wanting or necessarily needing to reproduce these fantasies in everyday life. So sexual fantasizing can be a safe space for experimentation. But pornography stereotypes are not just harmless fantasies. So they tend to reflect and shape deep-seated beliefs about social inequalities around gender, race, and power. And these happen even at levels that we aren't fully aware of. So by exposing how these stereotypes work, and by exposing how people feel attraction towards these stereotypes, we open up conversations about sexuality that move beyond the shame and taboo that currently really surround these types of topics. And this is important because if we want to have a healthier, more equal, and more fair sexual culture, it is important to start to talk honestly about pornography and its stereotypes within the context of sexual fantasy. Thank you.
Thank you, Samira. I want to introduce our next guest, and you might have already seen it. We're gonna talk about sexual fantasies and research you could actually contribute to, which is happening right now. And we're gonna talk about this with another researcher that's part of the Porn Types project, currently working on research about sexual fantasies. Please welcome Lena van Lande.
Thank you. Do you want me here?
Yeah, take a seat on the cliché leather couch.
Thank you.
So, people might have already seen it. You're doing research on it, but maybe a first question to you. What is a sexual fantasy? What are you currently researching?
Yeah, sexual fantasies are, like Samira also said, sexually arousing mental images. They can arise spontaneously, or you can consciously evoke them and also manipulate them, so you can change them yourself. And they can arise during non-sexual activities, so when you're on your way to work, for example, or you can actively call upon them during masturbation or during sexual activity with a partner. I think it's also important to mention that almost everybody fantasizes. I think across studies, I think it showed that almost 90% of the general population reports having sexual fantasies, so that's almost every one of us. And like Samira also said, it can be used as a safe space to experiment with your gender identity or with your sexual preferences, because it's in most of the cases not linked to actual sexual behavior. So that's also very important to say.
I'm not going to ask anyone about the sexual fantasies tonight, but 90% of you have had one. So
Yeah.
you know. So you're currently researching this. I can imagine that's quite difficult or quite taboo. So how are you doing this?
Yeah, we are getting ready to collect written down fantasies from people all over the Netherlands. You might have seen the posters indeed hanging around. So I'm very much hoping that some of you would also like to participate in our research. But it's, we want to know what sexual fantasies of the people in the Netherlands look like. And we're also interested in the role that stereotypes might play in these fantasies. Because there is this concern, like Samira also said, there's this concern in society, right, that we take over these, that we internalize these potential harmful stereotypes. So I figured if we do indeed internalize these sexual stereotypes, then they might also be present in our fantasies. And we're going to collect these sexual fantasies via the story completion method. That means that the participants see a couple beginnings of a story, different beginnings of a story, and they need to finish the story, and they can choose from these different beginnings, and then they send it in completely anonymous. And we are also we hope that this will lower the barrier a little bit to talk about these things, to write them down, fully anonymous, but also, because participants are writing about a fantasy scenario, so it's not something that actually happened to them. So hopefully that will lower the barrier a little bit. And on top of that, we're also interested in how participants reflect on their own sexual fantasies. So we are also hoping that at least part of the respondents will also take part in an interview, an in-depth interview, which we will do at the Erasmus Behavioral Lab, in which participants reflect on their sexual fantasy and tell us how they relate to their fantasy.
Yeah, because I'm also wondering, you're looking at this from, as Samira said before, a sociological perspective.
Yeah.
So these are individual fantasies you're seeing. So how does it look like? What you're going to aggregate them to see what comes out of it?
Yeah, I think for the most part of history, sex fantasies have always been seen from a more psychological point of view, psychological perspective, in which we see them as highly individual, highly subjective, and also from a more pathological point of view. So sex fantasies are often research from, for example, sex fantasies from perpetrators of sexually transgressive behavior or pedophiles. Those type of fantasies often get like a lot of attention in research.
Is that Freud's fault?
Yeah, yep, that is Freud's fault. Yeah, he saw sexual fantasies as a sign of sexual dissatisfaction, whereas later scientists like Ellen Laan, for example, is a big name, of course, saw sexual fantasies more from a positive point of view, so more from that it can be a sign of sexual satisfaction instead of sexual dissatisfaction. So you can actually get more sexual joy and arousal from it. And we're going to look at it from a more sociological point of view, where Samira also mentioned that we see that fantasies are not purely biological or psychological, but they are also influenced by these broader societal ideas that exist, and also maybe these stereotypes that exist.
Yeah, and you're also looking at how these are formed, and you brought a few sexual fantasies that people already gave to you.
Yep.
Nobody dared to actually read them aloud so we could play them. So I am going to play the perspective of a young woman, an old woman, and a young man. So bear with me as I try to be sensual about this, and we'll discuss this one. This is the perspective of a young woman. I would love to have sex with an older man. Someone who is bursting with experience and knows what to do to me. I just want to be able to see infinite lust in his eyes. I would prefer a role play where he plays my boss, so to speak, and I play the intern. And then, as punishment, you have to come to the office in the evening. So, what does it say about the person that wrote this?
Yeah, a couple of things I would say. I think this really relates to the image from 50 Shades that Samira also showed. I think these scripts are highly gendered as well. We know from research that sexual arousal isn't so different for men and women biologically. So it must be something else, because we do see different outcomes. We see that a lot of women fantasize about being the submissive one in this scenario as well, and men being the dominant, older, more experienced one. There's also a power hierarchy in this sense, so the boss versus the intern, which is then also gendered. Yeah, so those are a couple of things I would say from this fantasy.
Then another one. Now I'm going to take the perspective of an older woman. My fantasy is that I'm on a beach with someone, a man I know, and we are making love and enjoying ourselves. When another man joins us, someone I don't know, but who is very sensual and sensitive. He enjoys watching us make love, but also joins in. And what is very exciting is that they both really enjoy the fact that I get turned on, that I enjoy having sex. That they let me know that and say it to me. I think it would be wonderful to get very excited about. Very polite end. What does that say?
Yeah, also a little bit the gender aspect again, because she puts herself as the object of desire. Because she says, like, I would find it very arousing if if I see someone else, if someone else tells me that they're aroused because I'm aroused. So that's sort of the object of desire. That's also gendered. Also, I think the words sensual, those are words that are often connected to sex, to what is good sex is often sensual. This specific scenario is also on a beach, and I think the beach is also something that is very present, right? We all consider the beach to be a good place to have sex. I mean, maybe because of the sand, not so much, but for a lot of people it is. In movies and in porn videos, it's the thing that comes back. Yeah.
And I think my favorite one, it's a little shorter. The fantasy of a young man. My fantasy is to have a threesome with 2 buttons and then fuck them each doggy style. Clear.
Yeah, so very short. Also, again, a man in a dominant position, even though this is about 2 other men as well. But yeah, again, the dominant position. I think this is also quite an explicit one. I mean, and the doggy style is of course also considered a sex position that is, I think, often, I think a lot of people do that position. Also the explicitness of the fantasy is also interesting. I think if you grow up in a society where, for example, in the Netherlands, we're a bit more explicit about sex than in maybe other countries, and then you see that people fantasize a little bit more explicit too, compared to cultures where that isn't the case.
And maybe another question, based on this, how does shame come into the equation here? Because a lot of people might, if I would ask people here for their sexual fantasy, they would probably not respond to me, or maybe that's better if it's not the case. But what is the role of shame in this equation?
Yeah, I think shame comes from different things. Even though sexual behaviors are not, sexual fantasies are not linked to sexual behaviors per se, it can have real consequences in terms of these feelings of shame. And I think they can stem from different things. We see that if you deviate from these scripts that you're taught all of these sexual scripts, these, what we consider good sex, what we find attractive and whatnot. And I think if you deviate from that, that might cause shame. So if you're taught that your body should look a certain way, and then if you also fantasize about that but don't have that in real life, then of course you're going to feel a little insecure about that. I think it's also, like I said, if you grow up in a society where it's like sex is tied to a more sinful thing, then of course you're also going to feel shame about that. So those are 2 things from the top of my mind. Where these feelings of shame can stem from.
And if we maybe also connected to the earlier talk by Samira about porn, does this play a role in forming of fantasies, or are they a reflection of the fantasies? Is there any research into that?
Yeah, I guess you could say it's a bi-directional link as they influence each other. So you see that, of course, porn producers or porn websites, they make videos based on what they think people fantasize about. But what we also saw in our Lowlands research from last year is that there is indeed a group of people that only watches porn that matches their sexual fantasies. But there's also a group of people that watches porn to gain new material, to gain new fantasies from it. So that's also a interesting thing.
It can also break your fantasy or induce a new one.
Yeah, induce a new one. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Okay, maybe then people want to be part of this research. Can you maybe shortly explain how they could be part of this research?
Yes, if you want to be part of this research, you can scan the QR codes that are present on the posters. You can leave your email address only for us to send you some information later on the research, and then if you want to send in your sexual fantasy, that will be completely anonymous. So it will not be linked to the email address you leave now. And then you get via your email the Qualtrics link in which you can leave your sexual fantasy. And if you then also want to partake in an interview, you can then leave your email address again, and we'll contact you about the interview that will take place here on the campus.
So you heard it, scan the QR code on the way out and become part of this research. Lena, thank you so very much.
And please send me your fantasy.
Then, on to our final guest of the evening. She is a clinical psychologist and sexologist and an assistant professor at the Department of Clinical Psychology at Maastricht University, where she has established a sex lab to study sexual interaction between couples. She will talk about sexual fantasies, porn, and their role within relationships and sexuality. Please welcome Dr. Marieke Dewitte.
Thank you for inviting me and for introducing me. I'm going to take a little bit of a different perspective, make it a little bit broader. I'm going to talk about porn and fantasies, but mainly also about pleasure and relationships. Because the central question of this talk is how can pornography contribute to sexual pleasure in partner relationships? And then I want to highlight some of the concepts. Pornography in relation to sexual pleasure in the context of relationships. So let's first start with sexual pleasure, so that we are sure we're all talking about the same thing and you understand what are the preconditions of sexual pleasure. Let's start, why do people have sex? Research has shown that there are 237 reasons to have sex. And if you would just ask people on the street, why is sex and why do people have sex? We often think about this reproductive role, the biological function of sex. We have sex because we need to reproduce. But if you then think that people have about 2 children, you need about 30 times of penetration sex to get pregnant, then we know reproduction should not be the main reason why people have sex. What is the main reason? It's pleasure. We have sex because we like it. Mother Nature made sure that sex is pleasurable because as human beings, we only want to repeat what we like. If we don't like it, if there's no pleasure, we don't do it anymore. So it's actually important also for reproduction, if we want to focus on that sex is pleasurable. So it's so interesting to see that pleasure is the main drive of sex, but it has been ignored for a long time. If we look at research, science has studied sex from a biological point of view. Sex is reproduction. Male gaze, because we mainly had male researchers. I'm still a little bit biased because today I was in Utrecht and we were talking about female empowerment and how we can bring more attention to women in science, so I'm completely in my feminist stance now. But there are a lot of men in science and they were looking at male genitalia and the penis and erection and ejaculation because that is what you need to reproduce. We don't talk about pleasure because it's not necessary. And female pleasure, female genitals, well, why would we study that? It has no direct role for reproduction. Yes, the vagina and the uterus, that has been studied because that has a role in reproduction. But if we think about pleasure, we shouldn't focus on the vagina or the uterus because the vagina is a birth channel, has nothing to do with pleasure, much less sensitive than what really is the pleasure and the lust organ in women. It's the clitoris. In men, the penis implies reproduction and pleasure, but in women, the pleasure is the clitoris and reproduction is the vagina. So it's not penis and vagina, it's penis and clitoris. But it took until 1998, until the first, there were female researchers who actually thought, let's look at the female genitalia, let's look at the clitoris. Before that time, we just thought that the clitoris was this little knot on the outside. And then we discovered, oh, it's a big clitoral complex. It's a big organ, about 10 centimeters, that is located deep into the vagina. And it has the same parts as a penis. It has the glands, the corpus cavernosum, the foreskin. It's exactly the same. Women have on the inside what men have on the outside. And that makes sense because in the womb, we start from a female dimorphic ground plan. It's kind of a small clitoris that grows into a penis. We often say that the clitoris is a small penis, but it's the penis that is a big clitoris. And so you see that they actually look the same, and they function the same. Because what happens? What do you need? You need for male sexual pleasure to stimulate the penis that gets into erection. Well, we have the same in women. You stimulate the clitoris, and the clitoral complex will get into erection. And this is important because when it's in erection, there's more blood flow to that area, which creates pressure in the blood vessels, which means that blood plasma will be pushed out, and that's vaginal lubrication. And what do we need to experience penetration sex as pleasurable? A wet vagina. What do you need to have a wet vagina? You need to make sure you stimulate the clitoris. That's often the big problem. That's why a lot of women don't experience pleasure, because we skip the clitoral stimulation. Now, what is sexual pleasure? It's not the same as desire. It's not satisfaction. It's not orgasm. Because you can have pleasurable sex without orgasm. Orgasm is fun, but it's not necessary. And if we think about desire, desire is actually the memory of pleasure. Because what are the preconditions for sexual pleasure? There needs to be a stimulus. Something that is sexually interesting. A thought, a fantasy, a visual. We often are not aware of all these sexual stimuli that are around in our society. We pick that up. Our brain automatically picks up these sexual stimuli. We are not always consciously processing them, but they're there. And they will lower the threshold with which your sexual system gets activated. Now, our brain automatically picks it up, which triggers genital arousal, erection in men and in women. Now, important, genital arousal says nothing about desire, consent, or pleasure. This is just your brain saying there's something sexual, whether you like it or not. It's the moment you become aware of these genital arousal responses and you assign a positive meaning to it, you expect something rewarding, something pleasurable, which results in a subjective sense of arousal and the desire to actually do something with it. So important, we have body and mind. Our genital arousal and subjective arousal, they feed back into each other, they make each other stronger. So beginning arousal, subjective arousal will feed back, you get more horny, you get more turned down. But what is really crucial here is the aspect of pleasure, the expectation of pleasure, the expectation of reward. If you don't expect sex to be rewarding, you won't desire it. We don't want what we don't like. So basic. So desire is the memory of pleasure. Desire results from the anticipation of pleasure. So the best cure for low desire is making sex more pleasurable. So if we then think, okay, pleasure depends on good sexual stimulation, rewarding sexual stimulation, something that works for you. It's also about variation, because what we do know is that when you repeatedly show sexual stimuli to people, they get habituated. We call that the habituation effect. After 5-6 times the same stimulus, arousal goes down, and then you have Coolidge effect, which means you bring a new stimulus and arousal goes up again. That's the exact reason why porn has been invented, to satisfy this need on sexual variation. Because if you're in a relationship having sex the same time with the same bodies and the same, you kind of need some sexual variation, and porn is kind of a way also to deal with that. We can stimulate in different modalities, because porn is very obvious, like visual stimuli that triggers your sexual system, and we know that in general men are more inclined towards these visual stimuli. But there's also cognitive stimulation. Fantasies is also a way, this is also a stimulus that activates your sexual system. You can intentionally or spontaneously fantasize about sex. If we think about cognitive and fantasies, you can also think about erotic podcasts, erotic stories, because what we see in an erotic story or an erotic podcast, that you do have a script, you have a context, you have a story, but you can fantasize your characters. How do they look like? In what setting? How does it feel? And what we see in general also, that these podcasts are very popular now in women, because women are often more inclined towards fantasizing cognitive, while men like more the visual stimuli. But I'm always a little bit conscious about, gender differences, and men want this and women want that, because then we get this idea of men come from Mars and women from Venus, and women want to cuddle and fantasize, and men want to sex and climax. No, I mean, we're both from planet Earth, and also women want sex and orgasm and watch porn, and also men like erotic podcasts, so don't make it too general. These are our averages and tendencies. So fantasies are important and are an important source of stimulation. And if we think about fantasies, what are common fantasies, and it has been discussed, and Samira's doing great research in kind of categorizing all these fantasies, like taboo sex acts, multi-partner sex, passion romance, BDSM, novelty, being in non-monogamous relationships. These are fantasies that are often reported in research. Now, if you think about that, you can see also that there's kind of this gray zone because, like Samira is saying, like our fantasies and porn and everything is also shaped by stereotypes and societal views. And it's really interesting to see you have like vanilla sex and paraphilia. What is vanilla sex is kind of the common safe sex, safe sex not in terms of safe condom sex, but like, you know, not very exciting or not very novel or adventurous. And then you have paraphilia, on the other hand, which is more about sexual preferences that deviate from the norm. But what is then the norm? The norm is then the statistical average. But if you then see that nowadays people are fantasizing a lot about BDSM, like if you see the 50 Shades of Grey, Grey has really kind of inclined people to fantasize more, to include like bondage, some things in their sex. And so you could say like kinky sex has become a little bit more vanilla sex now. So what is then paraphilia? It's really interesting to see how our sex content also and fantasies are shaped by societal changes. Now, a common myth is that fantasies would reveal this underlying deep desire, which has also been discussed here in the panel discussion here. Like, yeah, but it's not. It's not necessarily an underlying deep desire. You could say that fantasies are the vibrator of our mind. It's just a stimulation. It's a story you create, and you're the director of your own story. You can fantasize about everything you want. Only research has shown that about one third of the people actually want to do something with the sexual fantasies. The majority of people just want to fantasize, do not necessarily want to act on it. So if you fantasize about BDSM, does it mean that you want BDSM in your sexual script? Maybe, but not necessarily. What we see in BDSM is sometimes that, for example, women fantasize a lot about submissiveness, and then kind of it can sort of be very difficult because I'm a feminist and I want a sort of power, and now I'm kind of fantasizing about submission. It's sometimes because you're very much in control and need to handle everything, and a fantasy is then more about submission, because letting go of control, like I don't want to be the leader in everything, I just want to undergo things. That's kind of the underlying theme in the fantasy, not necessarily the BDSM. So it's not necessarily this underlying deep desire. Watching porn fantasies might be seen as something missing in your relationship. It's cheating if you watch porn, if you fantasize, because what we also know from research is that a lot of women fantasize about having sex with somebody else than your partner. You could say, okay, it's a fantasy, but a lot of women will fantasize about having sex with somebody else while they're having sex with their partner. And then you could say, oh, but that's cheating, or there's something missing, you're not enjoying sex. No, it's a stimulus. You create a story that helps you to get aroused. It's not because you're not aroused enough by your partner. It can be very different meanings, like what we know, for example, also during sex, and especially women have the tendency to please the other, to focus on the other, like, is he or she still enjoying it? Is it okay? And they prioritize the pleasure of the other above their own pleasure. And fantasizing can be ways to stay in your own mind, to keep the focus on your own arousal. It's just a trick, something that helps you to get into the sexual arousal. So it's not necessarily signaling that something is wrong. And that's very important. That's why we need to kind of demystify fantasies, porn and everything, and just see how it can have a place in your relationship. Because if we see this, a lot of these myths about porn and fantasies are somehow related to the relationship. So what about porn, sexual pleasure in relationships? First of all, I think very important, pleasure is the measure. Sexual relationships are not about keeping the spark alive, or about how often do you have sex, how exciting is sex, how much sex toys do you use. It's about how often do you have pleasurable sex. That's what is important. It's also shared sexual pleasure. In a lot of relationships, one partner has pleasure, the other has no pleasure. It should be shared sexual pleasure, but shared sexual pleasure does not mean wanting the same at the same time. They're two individuals, people with different desires, different fantasies, different needs. It's unrealistic to expect that you both want the same at the same time. There are very often discrepancies in sexual desire. If you have a busy period at work, sex is not on top of your mind. So there's a discrepancy. That should not be a problem. There are often differences in what, how often, and when people want to have sex. It's really important about accepting that and making sure that one partner is here, the other partner is here, and what we often expect then is that we bring this partner to this level. That's the benchmark, this is the one with the problem. No, it's meeting each other halfway. Your desire is too high, yours is too low. How can we compromise? And in that sense, porn can be a good therapeutic tool, which I'm going to address. So in general, what we know is that sexual desire tends to decline in long-term relationships. So somehow, when you're in a long-term relationship, you will face a period in which there are discrepancies in sexual desire because we don't decline all at the same rate, in the same pace. First of all, the partner is always available. There's a lack of differentiation. The beginning of the relationship, you can desire each other, you're dating, you're planning in your mind, fantasizing about having sex. Myth of spontaneous sex debunked because it's not spontaneous. You know you're going to date your partner, you know you're going to have sex, so you're planning it. Lack of differentiation. In a lot of relationships, people are all about we and us. It should be me and you, and that's why also fantasies, watching porn, masturbation is okay. It's your part, it's your time, me time. You don't necessarily always need to have sex together with your partner. You can fantasize about your own private sexual world. You can watch porn on your own because you like it, and you can just masturbate in addition to partner sex. The one is not replacing the other. It can just be exist next to each other and in addition to each other. In the relationships, often less romance, less seduction, routine, in the sense in the beginning of the relationship, you do the efforts to kind of make sure you have nice lingerie or some other, or showering, and at a certain point you stop doing that. And that's kind of routine. In the beginning, you're kind of discovering each other, and at a certain point, you know where the buttons are, and then you say, oh, when I do this, he or she gets turned on, and it's like we press the button and the sexual system is on, which is very efficient, but in a way also less exciting. Less self-care, priorities on family work, so less me time, sex is not a priority. So there are a lot of reasons why sexual desire tends to decline in relationships. There are a lot of instances, periods in your relationship in which there will be a discrepancy. Very important is try to balance this. Reframe low sexual desire as a couple problem. It's normal in long-term relationships. Develop realistic expectations about sex, the good enough sex model. Sex does not need to be wow and fantastic and passion, and that's also one of the risks of watching porn, is that it seems wow and creative and all doing these interesting things like our sex is so boring, and then you kind of, maybe get lost in that fantasy of porn. So it's also important to tell people, sex can be great and you need to invest in it and make it a priority, and sometimes it will be passionate and sometimes sex will be just okay. And that's okay. That's good enough. Broaden your sexual script, because you can just accept, oh, well, it's normal that our sexual desire declines and it's normal that there are discrepancies in sexual desire, but if you really want to change that, you will have to work on it. You will have to talk to each other, discover, what do you like, what do I like, and broaden your sexual script, compromise. And in that sense, porn can be interesting because when you're here and you're here, then you can say, well, meet in the middle, but what do you do with this high desire? Well, watching porn and masturbating is not a bad option. Fantasize. Do something with the need for sexual stimulation. Don't put that pressure on your partner. So tips for more pleasure is, first of all, you need to explore, what do I need to get sexually aroused? It's about discovery and fantasies, so erotic podcasts, sexual stories, porn, can all be sources of inspiration to understand what do I need to feel sexual pleasure. Creating a context to actually an opportunity, date night, creating some intimacy to actually make sure that there is sexual stimulation so you can actually start to engage in sexuality. And communication. If you know what you want, tell your partner what you want. There are no good or bad lovers. You cannot say, my partner is not really good at oral sex. It's what do you need during oral sex, and tell your partner. Communication. And in that sense, stimulus context communication, that is what sexual pleasure is about. And in that sense, also porn, again, can work as a therapeutic tool. We often, as therapists, actually prescribe this to couples. Watch porn together. It can create stimulation, a source of inspiration, getting aroused, but it's also about communication. It's not necessarily, we don't not necessarily ask couples to watch porn because we want them to get horny by watching porn. It's more about eliciting and starting the conversation. Hey, what do you think about this? Does it turn you on? Oh no, not for me, that's really a killer. Oh, for me it's a trigger. Oh, why? And you start understanding each other. What do you like? What do you don't like? Because otherwise, if we say, communicate with your partner about sex, okay, now we're sitting on the couch and let's start talk about our sexual fantasies and our sexual life and what do we like and what do we don't like. It's kind of confronting this direct communication. So then, watching porn can be a good icebreaker to actually have the conversation about sex. Now, there are two sides to every story. Obviously, we know from the research that there are some risks involved in sexual development, but also in relationships. You could say miseducation about sex, because young people don't know what sex is, see porn, and then it's like, okay, this is what we need to do, so they start to imitate sexual behavior. It might endorse rape myths, objectifying women as sexual objects, more positive attitudes regarding casual sex and infidelity, which might lead to more breakup and divorce. Some studies have shown that. Sexual problems, because at a certain point men want more and more, we see that especially in men, and that there's kind of this desensitization idea that the sexual stimulation needs to be more and more extreme to get aroused, and then the real sex is kind of not satisfying enough anymore, and that could create sexual problems, unrealistic expectations, sexual ideals, which could interfere with sexual satisfaction. But there are benefits, and I think this is also so important. If we talk about porn, we often automatically assume the negative things. If you think about the hypothesis in research, the hypothesis is often what is the negative impact of porn on sexual development, sexual behavior, sexual relationships. But you could also say, why don't we assume a positive impact? Because porn might also have positive effects, like more accurate knowledge about sexual anatomy and function. Sex education is not inclusive and diverse, so a lot of people who do not identify with being heterosexual and monogamous and white people, what we often see in sex education at school, is kind of, search for information on the internet and see, okay, I don't identify with what I hear at my biology lessons, so what is now sex about? If you're queer, if you're in LGBTQI groups. So that could sort of be a good source of inspiration. Like I said, as a therapeutic tool, give you variation in sexual script, learn what you like and what you don't like, and learn to communicate, and dealing with discrepancies in sexual desire. So there are also benefits to porn. And that's also why it's so important to make sure that we look at both sides of the story. Now, porn in relationships, you can see it as compensatory or complementary, which means it kind of replaces partner sex, or it can be complementary in addition to another way of experiencing sexual pleasure. There's research showing that people who watch porn would report less satisfaction, less commitment, less communication with their partner, more aggression, more divorce, and that would be stronger in men than in women. But there's also research showing that there's more desire and more satisfaction when people watch porn. How can we understand this? Why are these mixed findings there? I think there an important point is also asking individuals or asking couples. Because if you do dyadic analysis and you ask both partners, to report on porn, then it becomes more interesting to see these mixed findings, to understand them, because what we often see, if there are negative impact on relationships, it's not about people watching porn, but about discrepancies in porn use. One partner is using porn and the other is not. And it seems that the discrepancies is more predictive of lower relationship satisfaction than the fact that people are watching porn or not. So dyadic and not individual data. Not knowing about the porn use of your partner, that's also something that has a negative impact on relationship variables. Watching alone versus watching together. It's also interesting. Do you watch porn on your own? Do you do it together with your partner? It can have different functions in your relationships and a different impact on your relationship satisfaction. Do you accept the porn use of your partner? Because there are a lot of attitudes, beliefs, emotions about porn use, and that will also have an impact on whether or not watching porn has a positive or negative impact. So I think this is really important. If we study the impact of porn on relationships, ask both partners and see the dynamics between partners, because these are more predictive than asking individuals about their porn use. Now, to end, I want to make a link to research in general and the bias in research, in the sense that our current research is very much focused on young people, heteronormativity, monogamous relationships, weird populations, which means Western, educated, industrialized, rich and democratic people, and that's kind of our bias. Cisgender and not transgender. So there are still a lot of biases also when we look at the impact of porn and how it's implicated and what the function is in relationships. We know that culture and all these different factors can have an impact, so we need to take that into account. There's also a big bias in research that a lot of research is studying individuals. And if you think about this traditional sex research, is done in individuals, which means, and I'm just going to show you this is an individual lab setting. If we want to make conclusions on sexual arousal, what do? We place individuals in the lab, we make them watch porn, we have instruments to measure their genital arousal, so it's kind of a tampon-like device in women that they have to insert into the vagina, which we can measure vaginal blood flow, and then there's kind of an elastic that men place around their penis so we can measure erection. And then they also have to indicate how sexually aroused they feel. But there's a big bias because you use porn here to elicit sexual arousal in individuals. And we make conclusions about sexual arousal. But this is more closely related to masturbation behavior and individual solitary sex. And we know that sexual problems often occur in the context of relationships. A lot of people don't have issues with arousal or orgasm when they masturbate, but they have issues when they have sex with their partner. So if we really want to understand sexual arousal, and especially when it goes wrong, we need to include both partners in the lab, see what happens. And we did some research. We thought, okay, let's bring both partners together, let them watch porn, and we see what happens in their body and in their mind. At that point, we saw it wasn't really working in the sense that sexual arousal was actually lower when the partner was present, and we expected, because especially women are very sensitive to relational factors and context factors, we thought sexual arousal will be higher when the partner is present because they're more emotionally engaged in the situation, but it was not, it was the opposite. And then we thought, yeah, it might make sense. You're sitting together, watching porn, might be a little bit awkward if you don't have experience with it. We also asked them to rate the sexual arousal of their partner, so then you feel very much watched by your partner, am I aroused or not? So it didn't really work out. And then we were thinking like, but why do we elicit sexual arousal by means of porn? Why do people have to watch porn? Why don't we just let them stimulate each other like they would do at home and measure their sexual arousal? And that's what we do in Maastricht. So first of all, we created a little bit of context, a sex lab. If you know, the lab rooms in a university building are often white rooms, a lot of wires, very clinical. So we thought, let's make it a little bit cozy because context matters. We get rid of the porn and people are actually stimulating each other, and meanwhile we're measuring their genital arousal, their subjective arousal, and see what happens and how they map their sexual arousal. We also have developed mobile measures so that we can actually also go at home in the bedroom and measure what happens when people have sex. And what we want to do is, especially what we call sexual synchrony, is kind of understanding how is sexual arousal functioning in relationships. Do partners tune their sexual arousal? Because you would assume that when you have sex, you have to pace a bit, like, oh, she's not there yet, he's not there yet, let's pace a little bit, let's get into the same level of sexual arousal? Can we see that? Can we see these signals? And what is happening, like if there's a rise in sexual arousal in one partner, does the other partner follow, and who takes the lead? And you could say it doesn't matter, but in terms of sexual problems, it matters. Because if you have lower arousal, do you drag the other one down, or can the one with high arousal lift you up? What happens? What is the dynamic in couples? We don't know at this point because it has not been studied before. So do partners tune? Does it matter? Do you need to be at the same level of sexual arousal? Is your sex better? Do you have more sexual pleasure when you're synchronizing in terms of sex? We don't know. Is it functional in every phase of the sexual response cycle? Because you could say during arousal it's important to turn each other on, but maybe during orgasm it's actually very important to focus on yourself and let go of your partner, because you need to own your own sexual pleasure. So then maybe synchronizing and tuning in with your partner is not a good thing. We don't know yet. Let's study that. Does it change over the course of a relationship? Also a very interesting question. Sometimes when you talk with people, they say, we just match. We're sexually compatible. We had this click right from the start of our relationship. Is that synchrony? Or is it something that develops over the course of relationships and people kind of adapt to each other throughout the relationship? Or can it already be there from the beginning? Does it play a role in partner selection? How does it operate in the context of sexual distress, especially because we see that sexual problems in one partner often go along with sexual problems in the other partner, so we want to understand what is happening there. So you would say we know already a lot about sex, but at the same time we don't know a lot about sex, and especially when it comes to sex in relationships. And there are a lot of labs in which you cannot do this type of research. Let's think about the States, USA, it's impossible to do this type of research. But in the Netherlands we can, because we have this very open policy, progressive policy. So this is really interesting research to actually see what is happening body-mind while partners have sex. So if you have questions about that or want to participate in our research, please do email me. We do give you money to have sex in the lab, so that's a good thing. Have sex for science. You can also get reimbursed for the travel expenses. So even if you come from Rotterdam all the way to Maastricht, you can get your train ticket reimbursed and then kind of have an exciting afternoon in our sex lab. Thank you if you have questions, but that's clearly part of the rest of the evening. Thank you.